By the early afternoon of August 7th, 1942, a perilous gamble was unfolding in the Solomon Islands. Just after 1 p.m., 18 Mitsubishi Zero fighters, dispatched from a forward base at Rabaul, descended over the southern coast of Guadalcanal. Below them, a spectacle appeared that should have been impossible. American transport ships, warships, and Marines were already on the beaches. The United States Navy had initiated its first major amphibious landing of the Pacific War, and the surprise was absolute for the Imperial Japanese forces. Among the pilots flying that day was a soft-spoken individual with a lineage stretching back 1,000 years. He held the rank of Petty Officer First Class within the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese Navy, which meant he was a highly experienced, non-commissioned aviator, lacking formal academy credentials, yet possessing a combat record that dwarfed many commissioned officers. His flying career dated back to the conflict in China, with victories over the Philippines, Java, and Port Moresby already to his name. His aircraft, a Zero-marked V-107 and later V-173, was becoming notorious among Allied intelligence for the pilot, who rarely seemed to be defeated. Above him, Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima led the formation as the flying officer of the unit, the most senior combat leader of one of the Imperial Navy's most decorated fighter groups. The overall commander remained on the ground at Rabaul, making Nakajima the direct operational leader his pilots looked to when danger approached. What transpired over the next 2 days above the Solomons would initiate a change within the Imperial Japanese Navy that could never be undone. The initial engagements on the 7th offered no immediate hint of this shift. The American F-4F Wildcats from the carrier Saratoga fought precisely as the Japanese expected. Swift passes, quick shots, then a dive to disengage. During that morning's combat, the experienced Japanese aviator brought down one such Wildcat. It was a prolonged, tumbling dogfight lasting 20 minutes, an aerial contest that has since been meticulously reconstructed. The American pilot, a Naval Academy graduate from the class of 1936, would himself become a 5-victory ace by war's end, having already destroyed 2 Japanese bombers that day before his Wildcats' guns likely jammed from prior damage. Despite this, he continued to fight, unable to fire but skillfully maneuvering to evade the attacking Zeros. The Japanese pilot, observing from above, joined the fray, unaware of his adversary's weapon malfunction. They circled and dove, each unable to achieve a decisive firing position. The Japanese aviator later recounted it as the most difficult dogfight of his career, expressing astonishment at the Wildcat's ability to absorb punishment. After expending over 200 rounds, a 20mm cannon shell finally struck the American aircraft beneath the left wing root, sending it down. The American pilot bailed out into the jungle, suffering 11 wounds, but was discovered by Solomon Islanders who concealed him from Japanese patrols, tended to his injuries, and eventually helped him reach an American-held airfield. He was evacuated on August 20th. The Japanese pilot returned to Rabaul, adding another tally to his aircraft, but also carrying a new, unsettling sensation. He had just encountered an American pilot unlike any he had faced before in the Philippines or the Dutch East Indies. As the days progressed after the initial landing, the American Wildcats began to demonstrate a different, unexpected mode of operation. The Japanese commander, Nakajima, was the first to witness it. He returned from a mission, disembarked his aircraft on the dusty coral strip at Rabaul, and for a time found himself unable to articulate what he had experienced. He described becoming the hunter, lining up behind a Wildcat, only for a second Wildcat, seemingly out of nowhere, to attack him head-on with guns blazing. He saw it too late, barely breaking off to escape. His experienced comrade watched him land, saw him descend from the cockpit, and noticed the tremor in his hand as he gripped the ladder, immediately understanding that a fundamental shift had occurred. The seasoned Japanese aviator later described this in his memoirs, translated for a global audience by an American interviewer. He noted that in the Rabaul barracks that week, pilots repeatedly asked the same question in various ways. Who had taught the Americans to fight like this? The elite of the Imperial Naval Air Service generally regarded Americans as not naturally adept at dogfighting, flying inferior aircraft, and lacking aggression in close-quarters combat. Yet, by late summer of 1942, a pair of these American pilots could now defeat even the most skilled Japanese aviators. No one at Rabaul had an answer. By the time the Imperial Navy finally grasped the true explanation, many of the men who could have acted on it would already lie beneath the waters around Guadalcanal, Santa Cruz, or the Philippine Sea. The question would then be moot, with no one left to fly a response. The originator of this new American approach was an individual unknown to Nakajima, an officer who had developed his ideas 9 months before the Rabaul Air Group ever established itself there, working at a kitchen table in a rented home in Coronado, California. His name was John Smith Thatch, though his friends called him Jimmy. The story of what he accomplished with a simple box of matchsticks in the summer of 1941 represents one of the most unexpected and significant acts of pre-war military innovation within the United States Navy. To understand this development, one must first appreciate the formidable adversary it was designed to counter. By all conventional measures of the early 1940s, Japanese fighter pilots were superior in the Pacific. This dominance extended back to the air campaigns over China in the late 1930s. They flew a better aircraft, establishing themselves as the undisputed masters of carrier aviation, a fact powerfully demonstrated in the first 6 months of the Pacific War from Hawaii to the Solomons. The Imperial Navy had cultivated this advantage through a deliberate strategic choice made in the late 1920s. Prioritize quality over sheer numbers. Starting in 1930, the Navy instituted the Yokerin program, a flight reserve trainee pipeline that recruited Japanese boys between 15 and 17, subjecting them to one of the most rigorous flight training regimens globally. The selection process was brutal. In 1937, for a comparable non-commissioned officer program, 500 applicants yielded only 70 accepted, with a mere 25 graduating. The experienced Japanese aviator mentioned earlier was one of these 25, having earned a silver watch presented by Emperor Hirohito for graduating first in his class. He was considered among the Empire's top fighter pilots by the age of 23. These highly trained individuals honed their skills relentlessly, practicing deflection shooting until they could consistently hit a dinner plate-sized target from 300 meters. They mastered landing on a pitching carrier deck in adverse weather, learned to discern surface wind from 5,000 feet, and flew at night without instruments. Their doctrine posited that an aerial dogfight was fundamentally a duel, a contest of skill and spirit. The pilot who saw first, shot truest, and flew best would prevail. Any other outcome meant defeat. Their aircraft mirrored this philosophy. The Mitsubishi A6M Type 0, or Zero, conceived under Chief Engineer Jiro Horikoshi and introduced in 1940, was designed around a single, overriding principle: unparalleled maneuverability. To achieve this, Mitsubishi engineers ruthlessly stripped weight, removing armor plating behind the pilot, eliminating self-sealing rubber liners from fuel tanks, and thinning wing skins. They utilized a magnesium-aluminum alloy, so light and brittle that the Zero could be torn apart by impacts that heavier American fighters might shrug off. In exchange for this inherent fragility, the aircraft gained an ascent rate exceeding 3,000 feet per minute, could outturn any Allied fighter then in service, and possessed an engagement range unmatched by any other carrier fighter globally. The Zero's combat radius, extending over 500 nautical miles, was a figure so extraordinary that Allied planners initially dismissed intelligence reports as exaggerated. The result, when these exceptional pilots and aircraft met Allied air forces in December 1941, was devastation. The Pearl Harbor Strike Force sustained minimal losses among its nearly 770 aircrew. Across the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and during the major Indian Ocean raid that drove the Royal Navy from Southeast Asia, Zeros decimated Brewster Buffaloes, Curtiss Warhawks, and Hawker Hurricanes, achieving kill ratios approaching 12-1. By April 1942, Any Allied pilot attempting to engage a Zero in a dogfight was generally considered doomed. Standing orders in some American squadrons explicitly prohibited turning with a Zero, advocating instead a diving escape, a dash for safety, or a prayer for cloud cover. This was the aerial landscape facing Commander John Smith Thatch in the spring of 1941, 6 months prior to Pearl Harbor, when he assumed command of Fighting Squadron 3 at Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. He had recently turned 36. His nickname, Jimmy, had been bestowed by upperclassmen at the Naval Academy to distinguish him from an older brother, James. He possessed a tall, lanky frame, a quiet demeanor, and a slow drawl from Arkansas. By the standards of the pre-war Navy, he wasn't considered a brilliant officer in the conventional sense, having neither graduated at the top of his class nor gained renown for daring exploits. Yet, he possessed a rarer quality, an ability to dissect problems methodically until their core mechanisms became evident. In September 1941, a critical document landed on his desk. The Fleet Air Tactical Unit Intelligence Bulletin, dated September 22nd, presented a detailed description of the Mitsubishi Zero, compiled from observations by the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, who were already engaging Japanese aircraft over China. The bulletin reported a fighter capable of climbing over 5,000 feet per minute, outturning any known American fighter, and operating at ranges the Wildcat could not match. While the Zero's actual climb rate was closer to 3,100 feet per minute, the bulletin's overestimation only amplified the grim picture. Thatch reviewed the figures, comprehending their implications. His aircraft and pilots were slated to confront an adversary they could not outmaneuver, outclimb, or outrun. He carried the bulletin home to the rented Coronado house he shared with his wife, Madeline. He read it repeatedly. That night, according to his later oral history with the United States Naval Institute, he sat at his kitchen table with a box of ordinary matchsticks. These matchsticks became aircraft, the wood grain patterns representing dogfights. He moved them across the table, observing how various formations reacted or failed to react to attacks from different angles. He continued this ritual for weeks. Tactical analysis late at night, flight tests over San Diego Bay the next morning, followed by debriefs and a rearrangement of the matchsticks for another attempt. His initial finding was that the standard American three-plane formation, a leader flanked by two wingmen, was ineffective against a faster opponent. The wingmen expended too much energy simply maintaining their position, rendering them unable to scan their own rear quadrants. Their own formation geometry made them vulnerable. He concluded that the fundamental tactical unit had to be a pair of aircraft, flying side by side, each covering the other's tail. This recommendation contributed to the United States Navy's formal adoption of the two-plane section as its basic fighter element in July 1941, a change that would have enhanced American fighter performance on its own. However, a single pair proved insufficient. Two Wildcats, regardless of their pilot's vigilance, could not consistently survive encounters with a faster, more agile enemy capable of dictating the terms of engagement, attacking, missing, and disengaging upward at will. Thatch persisted with his matchsticks. The solution, he discovered, involved two such pairs. For aircraft flying abreast, separated by a distance roughly equivalent to a Wildcat's turning radius. When a Zero attacked one pair, the other, observing pair would immediately turn towards the aircraft under threat. Simultaneously, the attacked pair would turn towards their rescuers. The two pairs would then cross paths. The Zero, fixated on its target, would suddenly find itself facing the gun barrels of the second pair, now flying directly towards it. If the Zero pressed its attack, it would be destroyed. If it broke off, the rescuers would swing onto its tail. There was no other viable option. The trap was geometric, not dependent on individual brilliance, superior gunnery, or the aircraft's equivalence to the Zero. It merely required two pairs of pilots to execute a simple turn at the precise moment. This maneuver could be taught to anyone. That was its brilliance. Thatch formally designated the maneuver the beam defense position, describing how the second pair intercepted the attacker from the side. Within weeks, his squadron pilots coined a simpler term, the weave, for its appearance from above. The enduring name, Thatch Weave, would be given to it the following year by his close friend, Lieutenant Commander James Flatley. Before committing this unusual tactic to actual combat, Thatch understood it required rigorous proof. In the autumn of 1941, he orchestrated an experiment that became legendary in American naval aviation. He enlisted his second section leader, a young Irish-American ensign, Edward Henry Butch O'Hare, who would, within months, become the Navy's first ace of the Pacific War and the first naval aviator to earn the Medal of Honor in World War II. O'Hare, 27, the son of a Chicago lawyer with a complex past, a 1937 Naval Academy graduate, was one of VF-3's most gifted pilots. Thatch specifically chose him to lead the attacker role, ensuring the Weave was tested against the best. Thatch outlined the exercise. O'Hare would lead a flight of Wildcats, operating at full power, simulating enemy attackers. Thatch himself would lead the defenders, flying the beam defense position with their throttles intentionally wired down to half power to mimic the performance handicap when facing a faster Japanese opponent. This throttle constraint was a critical detail, forcing the defenders to rely purely on geometric solutions rather than brute speed. They ascended over San Diego Bay. O'Hare attacked from above, from astern, and from every conceivable angle and altitude. Each time, despite their throttles being set at half power, Thatch's defenders either thwarted his attack or maneuvered into a position for a return shot. After landing and taxiing back, O'Hare, still wearing his flight helmet, walked directly to Thatch and uttered words that would become foundational to American carrier fighter doctrine. "Skipper," he said, "it really worked. I couldn't make any attack without seeing the nose of one of your airplanes pointed at me." What Thatch had devised at his kitchen table months earlier, he had now validated in the air. The remaining challenge was whether it would prove effective against the actual aircraft and pilots it was designed to defeat. The answer arrived in June 1942, during the pivotal carrier engagement of the Pacific War at Midway. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, the American carrier Yorktown launched its strike group around 8:40 a.m. 6 F-4F Wildcats from Fighting Squadron 3, led by Commander Thatch himself, comprised the entire fighter escort for 12 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers and an accompanying flight of Dauntless dive bombers. 6 fighters to protect 2 squadrons against the most formidable fighter force in the world presented an immediate problem. Thatch had to adapt his formation in the air, as 6 aircraft could not be neatly divided into 2 pairs of 2. He designated Ensign Robert Allen Murray Dibb, known universally as Ram, within the squadron, as his wingman. Dibb had only recently joined VF-3, a 21-year-old, untested graduate whose familiarity with the Weave consisted of a single hurried practice session with Thatch just days prior. Thatch then paired Lieutenant, junior grade, Brainerd Tucker McComber, on loan from VF-42, with Ensign Edgar Bassett, also from VF-42. McComber's radio was inoperative, and he had never formally trained in the Weave, a detail that would soon become critical. The remaining 2 Wildcats, flown by machinist Tom Cheek and Ensign Daniel Sheedy, were detached to provide low cover for the slower torpedo planes. As they neared the Japanese fleet, the small American formation was ambushed by Zeros from the Japanese Carrier Combat Air Patrol. Bassett's Wildcat was struck on the first pass, spiraling towards the water and erupting in flames, killing him. McComber's Wildcat also sustained fire, but remained airborne. Thatch suddenly found himself with 3 operational fighters facing a Zero Combat Air Patrol, which the official Naval Aviation Museum counts at between 15 and 20 aircraft, directly in his immediate engagement zone. McComber's silent radio meant Thatch could not communicate with him by voice. He had mere seconds to decide. What he did next stands as one of the most remarkable acts of small unit leadership in the history of air combat. He signaled Dibb wide to his right, using hand gestures across the cockpit gap to instruct Dibb to act as a section leader. He then ordered McComber to follow Dibb. The Zeros immediately pounced on Dibb, precisely as Thatch had intended. Dibb radioed for assistance and turned sharply back towards Thatch. Thatch, in turn, maneuvered towards Dibb. Macomber, unaware of the tactical interplay, but obeying orders, followed. Thatch positioned his Wildcat beneath his wingman, aligned the underside of the pursuing Zero in his sights, and fired. The 50 caliber rounds tore a line of holes from the engine, cowling along the fuselage. The Zero shed parts, then burst into flame. Thatch repeated this again and again. The Japanese pilots, trained from their first day at the Naval Academy to perceive dogfights as one-on-one duels, repeatedly committed to the perceived bait. Each time, the second Wildcat was already targeting them by the time they understood the trap. A few Zeros attempting to follow Dib through the weave instead of breaking off were shot down by Thatch as they passed directly in front of him. One Zero pilot attacking Macomber made the error of failing to follow his target through the turn, slowing to correct his aim, and was instantly destroyed by Thatch. By the time the Japanese broke contact and the surviving Wildcats turned back towards the Yorktown, VF-3 had been credited with multiple confirmed Zero kills for the loss of Bassett. Thatch personally claimed 3. Dib claimed 1. Macomber, frustrated and having broken formation in the heat of battle, claimed a probable. Cheek and Sheedy, fighting their own separate engagement in the lower section, accounted for at least one more Zero between them. 6 Wildcats, outnumbered, outclassed, facing the Pacific's most feared fighter pilots, sustained the loss of one pilot within 30 seconds, another with an inoperable radio. Yet they had damaged the Japanese Carrier Combat Air Patrol and returned with 5 of their 6 surviving aircraft. That evening, Thatch, writing his report in the Yorktown's ready room, was notably humble. The truth, he wrote, was that any success against the Japanese Zero fighter was not due to the performance of the Wildcat, but to the comparatively poor marksmanship of the Japanese, the stupid mistakes made by a few of their pilots, and the superior marksmanship and teamwork of some of his own. He significantly understated the triumph his men had executed on a hand signal, with one pilot entirely unfamiliar with the maneuver, the very tactic he'd spent 6 months developing on a kitchen table 8 months prior. Had the story concluded at Midway, the weave might have remained an interesting footnote in squadron memoirs. Its transformation into a tactical revolution lay in its subsequent diffusion. Within weeks, the maneuver had permeated the United States Navy and Marine Corps fighter community. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, who had served as executive officer of VF-42 at Coral Sea and was now forming Fighting Squadron 10, the Grim Reapers, aboard the carrier Enterprise, swiftly adopted it and began rigorous training. Flatley sent Thatch a personal message. For your information, I am calling it the Thatch Weave. He personally utilized it at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942, when his division of 4 Wildcats engaged Zeros from the Japanese carrier Junyo. One Japanese pilot, Lieutenant Yoshio, made several attack runs against Flatley's section, only to find himself looking down the guns of a second Wildcat each time, eventually abandoning the assault. Marine pilots flying from the rudimentary Coral airstrip at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, men living in tents, drinking from improvised containers, enduring nightly bombardments from the Tokyo Express, began employing the weave against the Zero fighters of the Tainan Kokutai from Rabaul. Henderson Field, originally a Japanese airstrip until the Marines captured it early in the campaign and renamed it from Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine dive bomber leader lost at Midway, became the home of the Cactus Air Force, named after the airfield's radio call sign. These pilots were perpetually short of spare parts, fuel, and personnel, and consistently outnumbered. By late 1942, every Wildcat squadron in the South Pacific incorporated some variation of the weave into its tactical playbook. Joe Foss, the Marine ace who concluded the Guadalcanal campaign with 26 confirmed kills and a Medal of Honor, employed numerous adaptations. Even dauntless dive bomber crews adopted it for their return runs from carrier strikes, understanding that 2 of them flying the weave provided their rear gunners with clear firing opportunities against any pursuing Zero. The maneuver demonstrated remarkable scalability, proving effective between fighters, between bombers, and even within mixed flights. As long as 2 aircraft committed to mutually protecting each other's tails, the geometric trap held. This brings us back to Saburo Sakai, to the rebel barracks, and to the unanswered question that continued to perplex the Japanese pilots. The day after his commander, Tadashi Nakajima, first encountered the new American tactics, Sakai himself experienced the limitations of a single zero against coordinated American teamwork. Late in the afternoon of August 7th, over the channel separating Guadalcanal and Tulagi, he identified a formation of 8 aircraft below him at approximately 7,800 feet. Believing them to be Wildcats, he dove, selected the lead aircraft, and began to line up a deflection shot. His assessment was incorrect. These were not Wildcats, but Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from a combined flight off the carrier Enterprise. Each bomber was equipped with a rear gunner operating a flexibly mounted machine gun. The aircraft Sakai chose to attack was flown by Ensign Robert C. Seawolf, whose rear gunner was Aviation Ordnanceman 2nd Class Harold L. Jones. Sakai opened fire, and Jones returned it. A burst from the American's rear cockpit shattered Sakai's canopy. A .30 caliber bullet grazed his skull, blinding his right eye and paralyzing the left side of his body. His Zero inverted and began to plummet towards the ocean. Sakai, with vision in only one eye, partial paralysis, and blood filling his cockpit, and no canopy, somehow managed to recover from the dive. The frigid air at altitude partially revived his faculties. He was over 400 nautical miles from his base, with a severe head wound, yet he refused to yield. He piloted his crippled Zero 560 nautical miles back to Rabaul, navigating by the volcanic peaks he had committed to memory from earlier missions, completing a 4-hour, 47-minute flight that remains unparalleled in the annals of single-seat aviation. He nearly collided with a line of parked Zeros on his approach, circled the field 4 times with his fuel gauge indicating empty, and finally landed on his second attempt. Upon landing, he insisted on delivering his mission report to his superior officer before allowing medics to place him on a stretcher. His friend, Hiroshi Nishizawa, the Tainan's top ace, personally removed the waiting driver and drove Sakai to the unit surgeon himself. Sakai survived. He permanently lost most of the vision in his right eye. After 5 months in Yokosuka Naval Hospital, he spent a year as a flight instructor, observing teenage pilots crash themselves during takeoff rolls because the Japanese training pipeline had been drastically shortened to compensate for combat losses. Then, against medical advice, he argued his way back into combat in 1944, flying Zeros over Iwo Jima and the home islands until the war's conclusion. He had been a petty officer first class when he was shot down. He was promoted to warrant officer in November 1943, but did not reach the rank of ensign until late in the war. He became Japan's most renowned ace, largely because he was one of the few experienced naval fighter pilots from the early Pacific War who lived to recount his experiences. Most of his comrades did not. Here, we must examine why the Imperial Japanese Navy never developed its own counter to the weave. The explanation lies in 2 pivotal decisions made before the war commenced. The first was the commitment to maintaining a small, highly selective, and elite pilot training program. In 1940, when the Imperial Navy was asked about expanding pilot training in anticipation of a protracted conflict, the proposal was rejected. Planners reasoned that Japan could not prevail in a long war against the United States, and therefore did not need to plan for one. The training pipeline would remain as it had always been. The pilots already in cockpits would bear the burden of the war. The second decision, made as the war progressed, was to keep surviving veteran pilots on the front lines until they were inevitably lost. In stark contrast, the United States Navy began rotating its experienced combat aviators home in 1942 and 1943 to train the next generation. The Imperial Navy did not. Sakai's training cohort, the elite Yokorin and Soren graduates of the late 1930s, continued flying combat missions until they were shot down. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign in February 1943, the vast majority of the experienced naval aviators who had attacked Pearl Harbor had been killed in action. The men who could discern the nuances of a fight, who understood when to commit and when to disengage, who could identify a wildcat acting as bait, now lay beneath the waves off Henderson Field, Santa Cruz, or the Eastern Solomons. Their replacements, products of a compressed training program accelerated by mounting losses, lacked the experience to recognize a tactical trap that even a veteran like Nakajima had only grasped too late. Sakai himself, after being removed from operational duty due to his head wound and assigned to instruct new pilots, chronicled his despair in 1943. "We could not watch for individual errors," he wrote, "and take the long hours necessary to weed the faults out of a trainee. Scarcely a day passed without fire engines and ambulances screaming down runways to extract pilots from aircraft they had wrecked during clumsy takeoffs or landings. They were instructed to expedite training, to overlook fine details, and simply teach them to fly and shoot." The man who had once flown combat from China to New Guinea was now witnessing teenagers perish during initial flight attempts and was ordered to send the survivors to the front lines regardless. Concurrently, the United States Navy was pursuing an opposite course. In 1942 alone, the American Naval Aviation Training Program produced nearly 10,900 pilots, almost double the total from the preceding 8 years combined. By 1943, this figure approached 20,800. Each new aviator arrived at the fleet with approximately 500 hours of flight time. Starting in April 1944, dedicated replacement air groups were established to provide a final polish to pilots before they joined operational units. By comparison, by 1945, Japanese pilots were being cleared for combat with less than 4 months of training and well under 100 hours in the air. The consequence was reflected in the kill ratios. The F-4F Wildcat, the aircraft for which Thatch designed the weave to ensure survival, ended the war with an air-to-air kill ratio of approximately 6.9 to 1. Its successor, the F-6F Hellcat, flying with the weave already embedded as standard squadron tactics, achieved a kill ratio against the Mitsubishi Zero exceeding 13 to 1. By the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, an engagement American pilots themselves dubbed the Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Japanese were deploying barely trained teenagers in obsolete aircraft against American pilots who had assimilated every weakness of the Zero from intelligence reports and captured airframes. The resulting slaughter was so one-sided that some American pilots, in their after-action reports, expressed something akin to discomfort. The nation that had forged the world's most elite pilot training program was ultimately undermined by its own pursuit of perfection. Their refusal to compromise on individual quality meant they could not produce enough of what they had. The Americans, who had embraced a system of mass production, replaceability, and teamwork over individual virtuosity, had constructed a pipeline that could absorb losses and continuously generate pilots. The weave represented the initial fissure in the dam. Everything else followed. What Thatch had truly achieved in his Coronado kitchen, beyond a specific tactic, was the validation of a more profound principle. He demonstrated that 2 airmen cooperating could defeat a single ace every time, regardless of the ace's skill, the superiority of his aircraft, or his years of training. He transformed the ancient concept of mutual support into a geometric pattern that any reasonably competent fighter pilot could execute after a single demonstration. He had made teamwork a transferable skill, a concept that could be taught to an inexperienced ensign in an afternoon and trusted in combat the next morning. That was the actual accomplishment of the matchsticks on the kitchen table. The Imperial Japanese Navy never developed an equivalent doctrine, partly because doing so would have required acknowledging an institutional truth they could not accept. The Zero was conceived around the individual ace. The Yokorin program was built around the individual ace. Japanese fighter doctrine, ingrained in pilots from their first day at the Naval Academy, centered on the individual ace. To counter the weave, the Imperial Navy would have had to instruct its pilots that no individual, regardless of skill, could defeat 2 coordinated opponents, and that survival demanded flying as a team, not as a collection of duelists. They could not bring themselves to do this. They continued to send men to die, one at a time, against opponents who had already committed to fighting in pairs. The true verdict on the Pacific Air War is not that American pilots were individually superior to the Japanese. In 1942, pilot for pilot, the Imperial Naval Air Service likely represented the finest fighter community globally. The verdict is that the Americans stumbled upon a superior system, a doctrine that did not rely on the exceptional individual, fused with a training pipeline that did not depend on the exceptional individual, supported by an industrial base that did not depend on the exceptional individual. The weave marked the moment when this system first proved its dominance over Japanese individual brilliance, and the Japanese never regained the ground lost in the months following Midway. The men who devised and first employed the weave did not realize they were redefining air combat for the next 80 years. Their immediate goal was to keep American pilots alive against an enemy aircraft that could outturn, outclimb, and outrange them. They resolved that immediate problem and, in doing so, inadvertently solved a much larger one. The principles they established, two aircraft protecting each other's tails, the bait and the hook, the geometric trap for an attacking pilot, are still taught today in every Western air combat training course. United States Navy F-4 Phantom crews used variations of the weave against MiG-17s over North Vietnam in the 1960s. American pilots flying F-15s and F-16s now train on these same foundational principles. Most of the individuals who made this work do not have grand monuments. Edward Butch O'Hare did not survive the war. On the night of November 26, 1943, leading a section of 3 aircraft, 2 F-6F Hellcats, one flown by him, another by Ensign Andy Scone, and a TBF Avenger flown by Lieutenant Commander Phil Phillips, on what would have been one of the earliest nighttime fighter intercepts attempted from a United States carrier. They sought to disrupt a Japanese torpedo bomber attack on the American task force. In the chaotic confusion of the night engagement, O'Hare's Hellcat was lost. His body and aircraft were never recovered. He was 29 years old. The Chicago airport bearing his name was rededicated in 1949, though most people who pass through it daily remain unaware of his story. Robert Allen Murray Dibb, the inexperienced Ensign Thatch brought into the right-hand position of his weave at Midway, also did not live. He died in a flying accident on August 29, 1944, 2 years and 2 months after his combat debut, having become an ace himself with 7 aerial victories. He was 23. There is no statue commemorating him, and he appears as a footnote in most accounts of Midway. Yet, on the morning of June 4, 1942, when the Thatch weave faced its first combat test in human history against the Pacific's most feared fighters, he made it work with a hand signal across a cockpit gap and the raw instinct of a new pilot making the correct move. Saburo Sakai, on the other hand, lived a long life, passing away on September 22, 2000, at the age of 84. He retired from the Imperial Navy as a lieutenant, junior grade. He became a Buddhist, abstaining from taking any life, even that of a mosquito. He grew critical of the war Japan had fought and became a vocal opponent of the militarism that had propelled his generation into the cockpits of those Zeros. He visited the United States multiple times after the war. In 1983, near Los Angeles, an American historian named Henry Sakita arranged a meeting between Sakai and Harold L. Jones, the rear gunner from Bombing 6, whose machine gun bullet had almost ended Sakai's life over Tulagi 41 years prior. They exchanged gifts, shook hands. Sakai presented the bullet-pierced flying helmet he had worn on August 7, 1942, still bearing the mark of Jones's marksmanship. 2 elderly men in a quiet room, both having survived experiences they had no business surviving. Jimmy Thatch himself continued a 40-year career. He commanded the escort carrier USS Sicily, CV-118, during the Korean War. In the late 1950s, as commander of Task Group Alpha, flying his flag from the carrier USS Valley Forge, he pioneered anti-submarine warfare doctrine, work that established the template for how the United States Navy hunted Soviet submarines throughout the remainder of the Cold War. He was promoted to 4-star admiral in 1965. He retired in May 1967 as Commander-in-Chief United States Naval Forces Europe, dying in Coronado, California, on April 15, 1981, 4 days before his 76th birthday, in the very town where he had conceived the weave at his kitchen table 4 decades earlier. When questioned about it in his oral histories, he consistently deferred credit to his pilots, especially O'Hare, who had tested it, and Flatley, who had named it. So, here finally is the answer to the question Sakai's pilots kept asking each other in the Rabaul barracks in August 1942. Who taught the Americans to do that? The answer is a soft-spoken Arkansan named Jimmy Thatch, who, in the summer before Pearl Harbor, read an intelligence bulletin he could not disregard, sat at his kitchen table with a box of matches, and meticulously worked through the geometry of how 2 aircraft could defeat one. He proved it with a wired throttle test against Butch O'Hare in San Diego. He proved it again in actual combat at Midway with an inexperienced wingman, a silent radio, and a hand signal. His friends and protégés proved it repeatedly at Guadalcanal, at Santa Cruz, at the Philippine Sea. By the end, the men who had set out to be the world's best individual fighter pilots had been defeated by men who had made a prior agreement not to fight alone. Most of these stories are about ordinary men who faced problems the world deemed unsolvable and, using whatever was at hand, whether matchsticks on a kitchen table or tools at a workbench, solved them anyway.